August is here, and that means that the weather and the election cycle are heating up. The best way to beat the heat and stay up to date on the latest news from the US election to international breaking headlines is to become a DSR member and gain access to additional content across our network, in addition to other exclusive benefits. Use code BEATTHEHEAT to get 50% off of your membership and sign up today at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's Beat the Heat at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Now please enjoy the show.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. After Barack and Michelle Obama brought the House down by ripping into Donald Trump at the Democratic Convention this week, it seemed to open a floodgate of responses from the former president. Trump ranted that the Obamas had called him names, vowed to unleash more personal attacks on Kamala Harris, and blamed his advisors for holding him in check. We think Trump is deeply rattled right now by a hidden dynamic. It's highly likely the convention is in the process of uniting the anti-MAGA coalition, which, if it happens, is real trouble for Trump. A new Politico magazine piece digs deep into recent polling and finds a striking shift towards Harris among a whole range of disparate voter groups who together really make up that set of anti-MAGA constituencies. Today we're discussing all this with Laksha Jain, who co-authored that Politico piece and does modeling for the data group Split Ticket. Great to have you on, Laksha.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, first let's go over Trump's response to the Dem convention. Here's what he said about the Obamas at a rally in North Carolina on Wednesday.
Did you see Barack Hussein Obama last night? Take little shots. He was taking shots at your president. And so was Michelle. You know, they always say, sure, please stick to policy, don't get personal. And yet they're getting personal all night long, these people. Do I still have to stick to policy?
Then, at another point, Trump went back to ranting about his advisors, blaming them for reining him in from making personal attacks. And he also went on a tear about how Democrats are supposedly going to cheat in the election. I think his anger at his advisors is a key tell. They're telling him specifically that he needs to tone down the attacks on Harris in order to appeal to independents and moderates. What he sees is that she's gaining ground among those groups. His advisors, whatever they're telling him, it's not working, right?
Yeah, that's basically exactly what's going through his mind, I'm pretty sure right now. If you look at what he's behaving like since Kamala Harris took over, you can say some of it is his own character, some of it is anger at the fact that Biden dropped out, but whatever the case, his advisors are telling him stuff, and he's either saying that it's not working, or he doesn't agree with what they're saying and says, well, I'm going to do the same thing I did since 2016. I'm going to be me. That made me win the White House. That made me almost win a second term. Who are you to say? Because you guys have no idea how to counter her either. You didn't expect this. You said she was weak.
Right. In his mind, the only election that's ever happened in human history is the 2016 election. That's his touchstone for everything. Laksha, let's talk about your analysis. You guys looked at a number of top-tier polls and compared their results from their matchup of Biden versus Trump just before Biden dropped out versus their most recent results of Kamala Harris versus Trump. You found a 9-point shift towards Harris among independents, a 12-point shift among blacks, a 17-point shift among young voters, a 7-point shift among women, a 6-point shift among Hispanics, and even a 5-point shift among non-college voters. So you guys conclude that this shows Harris is largely repairing the Democratic coalition. Can you talk about those findings?
Yeah, one of the striking things about the entire 2024 polling cycle was that Joe Biden was, in the words of many pollsters, doing the hard part. He was holding, Democratic ground with a lot of white non-college voters, older voters, but he was really weak among core Democratic groups like Black voters, Hispanic voters, young voters. His margins with Black voters were at an all-time record low for a modern Democratic nominee. His margins with young voters were preposterously low, and his approvals were horrible by every metric you could imagine among these key groups. As soon as Kamala Harris has come in, she has largely reversed that decline almost overnight. She has suddenly started to approach traditional Democratic margins with those types of voters that Joe Biden was struggling with. And she has, in essence, almost in 3 weeks, with the snap of a finger, has managed to repair all of that damage that seemed to be done to the Democratic coalition with Joe Biden at the top of the ticket.
The second Biden left, that damage started to repair. So this race is still very close. The 538 averages have Harris up nearly 3 nationally, nearly 3 in Michigan, 1.3 in Pennsylvania, 3.3 in Wisconsin, and she's even slightly up in Arizona. To be clear, the reconstituting of the Dem coalition that you're finding, plus that movement among independents and women, that's largely what explains Harris edging ahead now, right?
Completely so. Yes, exactly. Kamala Harris has made substantial gains, and she's managed to not only repair the Democratic coalition. You see a 7-point boost among core Democratic voters, which obviously contributes to a significant gain, but she's done it without losing ground with independents, which is traditionally the big balancing act that people try to strike. You either try to gain ground with your base, but don't try to turn off independents, or you try to gain ground with independents without really riling up your base too much. But she's managed to do both.
The story among independents is kind of amazing. There's this big debate out there now about whether there's this thing called an anti-MAGA coalition or not. Your new numbers, your findings suggest to me that the elements of such a coalition are really there. As soon as an acceptable alternative to Trump and the deeply unpopular Biden came along, you have this instant movement among these groups that are really, pretty widely ranging ideologically. Huge movement among young voters, non-whites coming back, but also independents, as you just said, women and non-college voters. Let me ask, if there is an anti-MAGA coalition, I think there is, but, this would be it, right? It's young voters alienated by MAGA, right-leaning independents and women who can't stand Trump and are angered by Trump's Supreme Court striking down Roe v. Wade. It's non-college voters as well who can't stomach Trump, right? Isn't that basically the anti-MAGA coalition? Plus educated voters, especially women?
Yeah, that's absolutely the seeds of an anti-MAGA coalition, I would say, because it's important to remember Donald Trump has never really been popular. He's always been an unpopular candidate. As soon as you put a candidate against him who is acceptable to the broad majority of the electorate, who doesn't have competency questions about him, all of a sudden, that candidate starts to look a lot better by comparison. It doesn't matter what people thought of them before. With Joe Biden, the entire cycle had been defined around his age. And people were begging, give us a younger nominee, give us someone who we think can win, give us someone who can talk, give us someone who we think can run the country. And in Kamala Harris, they've gotten that. And she's leaned into that by embracing her DA background, by looking more moderate in ads, by trying to talk about uniting the country without getting to Donald Trump's negative attacks on her. And so she's really leaned into that anti-MAGA angle. She's really said, look, I'm a common sense governing person. You don't need this extremism. And we heard your concerns with Joe Biden, and we fixed them.
Absolutely. You guys can conclude, again, that the movement of independence is a big story. As you mentioned earlier, I want to bear down on that a bit. To me, that shows, once again, this anti-MAGA effect, because getting right-leaning independents into the Democratic coalition has really been a key pillar of this anti-MAGA coalition that has shown up in the last 3 elections, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You can't win these elections without a large coalition of independents. And Harris making a lot of moves to try and get them back is absolutely critical. You could see it in the convention when she got the Mesa mayor to speak for her. You can see it in the types of appeals she's making in border messaging, in policing, in fracking, where it's clear that these positions are obviously opposite to what her base would want. But her base is just happy that they have someone who's not Joe Biden that they can all unite around. That gives her the leeway to really start to appeal hard to these more right-leaning, moderate independents and say, I hear your concerns, but I'm not one of those extremist Democrats. I'm a common sense one. This is what I think. It doesn't matter what she said before because now she's in the public eye and she can redefine herself, and she's been doing that.
You raise a really critical point there, which is that Democrats, core Democrats, that is, are really kind of okay with this outreach to right-leaning independents and even to moderate Republicans who can't stand Trump. I think Democrats understand that this anti-MAGA coalition is the way to beat Trump. It was the way to beat him in 2020. It was the way to hold off the red wave, which everybody promised us was coming in 2022. In all these statewide races, they were able to defeat the MAGA crazy candidates in exactly that way by putting together coalitions like that in places like Arizona. Pennsylvania was a little easier because the Josh Shapiro's opponent in the gubernatorial race was a real nutbag. The critical thing here is that Democrats, core Democrats, understand that they can't do this themselves.
Exactly. There has been a really big spike in electability concerns over the Democratic coalition ever since Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump, because a lot of them thought, Hillary Clinton can't lose to Donald Trump. This is Hillary Clinton who almost beat Obama in 2008. How could she possibly lose to Trump? The minute that happened, they realized their mental model of how voters worked was extremely far removed from reality. And I think that's why Joe Biden surged in 2020, despite really lagging in polling in 2016 hypotheticals. And that's why Kamala Harris has been given such leeway by her base, because they just went through an entire cycle, really, of worrying about, can Joe Biden beat Donald Trump? And now that they've got a chance, they're like, hey, we've got you here. We got what we wanted with a younger nominee. Now do whatever you need to do and just beat this guy.
Yeah, and one other thing about the independents I wanted to point out, which is that you've seen a lot of kind of prominent MAGA media types really coming out and warning Trump that he's in some trouble, right? They're saying stuff that Trump hates to hear. We talked about this earlier. They're on Fox News, they're saying things like tone it down, stop the racist attacks. They don't use the word racist, but I'll use it here. They're really trying to get Trump to not alienate independents and suburban women, right? So MAGA knows that this anti-MAGA coalition is constituting. You can see this fear among them in the Fox News figures when they say this kind of stuff, don't you think?
Absolutely. You can see it because it's there and it's happened before. Donald Trump lost the election in 2020, and it was in large part because he couldn't get out of his own way. He had a pandemic that actually raised approvals of a lot of world leaders. He had stimulus checks that were extraordinarily popular, that were basically delivered by a Democratic House. And despite all of that, his own personal conduct and his own rhetoric made him one of the most unpopular presidents in history running for re-election. And that's why he lost. And so this time around, he's seeing a repeat happening in front of him, because it's not like the American public exactly agrees with him on most things, is the thing.
It's so interesting because his handling of COVID, which if he had handled it well, could have raised his approval and won him the election, as you point out, his actual handling of it reflected his own pathologies and, inability to really see clearly what the real electoral threat to him was. And then that really birthed the anti-MAGA coalition in 20, I think, in a big way. I want to go to young voters, because what you find is really striking. We saw that in 2018, 2020, and 22, high turnout among them was critical to Dem wins in all those three cycles. Again, a big part of this coalition that came together to defeat Trump. Then in 2023 and 2024, though, they were badly alienated by Biden and were drifting big time. But now with Harris, they're coming back. Can I ask, do you think that this energized youth vote against Trump and MAGA now is really proving to be a genuine and durable factor in our politics in the Trump era? Is it a real thing?
I think so. I always hesitate to say things like that because the electorate has a very funny way of reversing course on anyone that makes those proclamations.
Yeah, voters do that, don't they?
In 2022, the one consistent theme, look, we model candidate quality all the time at Split Ticket. That's really one of the biggest things we try to show. Why do voters split their tickets? And what we consistently see is that there are three main themes that make a candidate very, very unpopular. The biggest one is ideological extremism. Then there's being out of touch with your constituents, having bad constituent services. And then there's basically letting your opponent define you entirely on the airwaves. Usually all three intersect. And in this case, what happens is Donald Trump's own handpicked candidates who try to replicate Trumpism without Trump show that movement has very big ideological flaws.
Yeah.
It is not popular because they always, to get Trump's endorsement, they always focus on the stolen election of 2020 in their words. Then they talk about banning abortion. Then they can't help themselves and they start leveling race-based attacks, which, look, people didn't like Hillary Clinton saying, I'm going to be the first woman president, but they also don't like it when Donald Trump talks about Kamala Harris's identity. Their preference is not to think about race. It's not to go negative against someone's race. And so what we consistently see is that Trump's movement always ends up losing elections for Republicans. If I may say, Greg, I've heard from so many Democrats that Trump was a net positive for the Republican Party because of his higher turnout or his lower propensity voters and his boost with them, and because they gained Senate seats in 2018 and because the Electoral College bias. And I point out to them, I said, look, it's not like the Republican Party was losing before Donald Trump came to office. They had 54 Senate seats and a big House majority. Donald Trump is the only reason they lost them.
I think people really have a great deal of trouble accepting the idea that Trump only won once in 2016. He and MAGA presided over the biggest string of GOP losses, I think, in many decades, with 2018, 20, and 22. So non-white voters, you guys find non-white groups coming back to the Democrats, but I think clearly Harris's level of support among them is still not where it needs to be, right? I mean, my sense is there's still room for her to grow among these groups and get to where she needs. What's your general feeling on all that?
I think that's right. I think there is a substantial amount of room to grow still. It's important to note she's not matching Biden's 2020 margins yet. She's not matching a lot of those 2016, 2012 margins. And that's despite, her own appeals right now trying to cater heavily towards those communities' actual concerns, right? Like, for example, with Hispanics at the border, she is saying, we are not in favor of increased immigration. We need to be tougher on the border, which we know plays well in South Texas. Despite that, she's not replicating Biden's 2020 numbers among either group. So there is some room to grow, and I think there is some movement there that can still be had for her. The flip side also goes, right, that she could lose some ground with them or with other voters as well, because her candidacy and her image is very malleable right now.
Where do you think she has to get to with Black voters and Hispanic voters to win the election?
To be completely honest, I actually think that if she holds where she is with white voters in polling, she doesn't need to make many more gains because the United States is predominantly white still, and in the swing states, that balance is even higher. If she wants to win the Sunbelt states, she's got to get those numbers a little bit up. To win Georgia, you have to start doing 5-6% better with Black voters than she's been doing right now. To win North Carolina, you need that too. To win Arizona, you can hold where you are with whites, but you probably want to do a little bit better with Hispanic voters. And Nevada isn't even a state that you can realistically swing unless you get back to something close to Biden 2020 numbers with Hispanics. So really, you don't need those to win the election, but they do open up another path.
Right, and I think that they're keenly aware of this, and a lot of money is going to be spent toward that end. Let's talk about how Trump sees the Democratic convention, right? He sees the elements of anti-MAGA America there. The Obamas, Barack Obama won popular majorities twice for the first time since Ronald Reagan. His coalition is older than it used to be, but it's still pretty vibrant. You see these displays of youthful energy. You see these Republicans who are being brought out on the stage who endorsed Harris with speeches at the convention because they see Trump as a menace to democracy in the country. That's a clear nod to this kind of right-leaning independent, right-leaning moderate Republican voter out there that is part of the anti-MAGA coalition. And then, as you said, Southwest mayors who are independent-minded. That's another bid for these types of independent voters and so forth. Then you have, Trump raging at Harris's crowds. In North Carolina, he angrily rants that Democrats are going to cheat. For Trump, all that is just shorthand for I'm losing and that can't possibly be true. But I think these rants really betray an awareness that he just might be losing, at least for now. It's very close, but an awareness that anti-MAGA America is a big thing, and it's a real problem for him.
It's the spiral, isn't it? When you're losing, your instinct is to revert to your base, really. It's to revert to what you've always known. And it's an instinct to fight in Donald Trump. And the problem is the way that he fights is not popular. It's very easy to look graceful when you're on top. It's very, very difficult to look strong when you're falling consistently. And to some degree, this is kind of what's happening as he sees the seeds of the anti-Trump coalition start to get reassembled, where base Democrats unite with independents of all stripes. That's when he starts to get worried, because he sees, well, this happened once before. And Donald Trump knows that he lost in 2020. This is the thing that I keep trying to tell people. He knows he lost.
Yeah, he absolutely does.
Doesn't like it. He doesn't want to believe it, but he knows that he lost.
Right. His supporters aren't allowed to ever sense that he might be losing. So that's why he goes out there and he just says to his supporters at times like this, they're going to cheat. Let's listen to a little audio of him saying just that at his North Carolina rally.
We are going to fight like hell to win this election. They are going to cheat like hell to win the election because they have no bounds. They have no bounds.
This, I think, really shows that he gets into the type of death spiral that you're talking about. He is so determined to keep his base enthralled to the idea that he's invincible that he goes down this road talking about how Democrats are going to cheat. He's going to pardon January 6ers, the rioters who attacked the Capitol, because they're heroes and patriots. Nobody could have possibly done anything wrong that day. He won the election. But then, again, that's the stuff the independents, the moderates, the suburban women hate, right?
Yeah, basically entirely that. Yeah, I mean, he hit the nail right on the head.
It's an amazing thing. He gets into these spirals. Okay, so what's the bottom line all this, right? Like, one of the stories in the media about this election is that, okay, Harris is kind of riding a certain kind of high. I think that's obviously true. She got weeks of positive press, right? Democrats.
I want to point out something, though, Greg.
Yeah?
Early definitions can be very, very sticky. It is true Harris got 1 month of full positive press coverage, but that's when people make their decisions on who they think she is. The cake is usually baked by September.
That's very fascinating. Can you talk a little more about that? I mean, they're spending, $500 million attacking her as a crazy radical with ads that show her dancing in a Hawaiian shirt while they talk about migrants invading the country. It's supposed to be Kamala Harris dancing with the enemy, partying with the enemy. She's going to let criminals burn down cities. You think that they're running out of time to define her?
I think so. I think that they realistically have 1 more month to define her, and they're given that leeway because, well, she's relatively new. But I think if at this point, if you can't change that track of favorable skyrocketing, unfavorables dropping like a stone by mid-September, then you're realistically not going to be able to do it because people are already going to start voting by the start of October, right? And at that point, campaign focus has changed. And the debate with Donald Trump is probably the last real chance the Trump campaign has to make that type of impression, because that is going to be a big part of the country's reintroduction to Kamala Harris. And if they can't use that debate to negatively define her, it's going to be a very difficult thing for them to do.
You sure would expect her to be very prepped for it as well, far more prepped than Biden was. Laksha Jain, thanks so much for coming on and having such a fascinating discussion with us.
Thank you, Greg.
Folks, make sure to check out some great new content we have up at TNR.com. Alex Shepard observing that Democrats aren't really talking about democracy anymore as much these days. And Grace Seegers meditating on the convention that almost wasn't, how Democrats who are facing all but certain electoral doom are suddenly, with Harris at the top of the ticket, having a raucous, energetic party. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.